Well, most of us are here and people can continue joining. Welcome everyone to the event. My name is David Swanson. I am a co-founder and executive director of World Beyond War. You can learn about us at WorldBeyondWar.org. We are a global organization that does education and activism toward ending all war. I will be helping out at the end of this program with questions and answers. You can post questions, as always, at any time in the chat, or you can plan to use the raise hand function when we get to the questions and answers period and be called on. Usually you'll find that clicking on participants and then on raised hand, or on I think on participants. And our host for this program will be Youri Smouter, who has his own program on YouTube, and I will introduce him after my brief initial remarks. So without further ado, I am very glad that Youri and everyone else involved has put this together. I expect the question and answer section, if not what precedes it as well, to involve some spirited debate, which I, of course, think of as a very good thing when done intelligently and respectfully. Syria has, as many of you know painfully well, for the past decade, I think, far and away, at least in pro-peace US politics, been the topic where disagreement and bitter division and failures to engage in civil discussion have been the most severe. I don't claim to understand all the reasons for this. I think in part it's because our culture has a lot further to go than we sometimes imagine to get to a position of opposing war. We oppose particular sides of particular wars, even US wars, at least when the US president is from a particular political party, but we don't oppose war. And war, unlike reality, always involves an evil enemy lacking any redeeming features. For years, we have seen the slightest opposition to US and allies war making in Syria immediately denounced as taking the side of the evil Syrian government, and any opposition to the war making of the Syrian government instantly rejected as the evil lies of an imperialist. And pointing out the horrors committed by both sides merely brings down the wrath of both sides upon your head, usually with accusations of having equated two unequal things, as though two things cannot both be flawed without being equal. One must be pristine and the other satanic. This is war, after all, whether we like it or not. But if we truly did not like it, we would refuse to think on its terms. In the real world, victims often commit atrocities. Liars often tell the truth, and horrendous evils can be put in perspective or explained, but cannot be erased by other evils. The case against US militarism and allies militarism is familiar to us, and I think as clear in Syria as anywhere else. Crimes, real or pretended, don't justify other crimes. And lots of them have been pretended, lied about, concocted to trick the world. Wars and threats of wars don't reform bad governments. They make them worse. Murderous allies are not moderates, but murderers. Public opposition in the US, the UK, and elsewhere to this war that prevented major bombing in 2013 was right, not just because the US was proposing to join with groups it had depicted as the ultimate evil for 12 years, but also because violent overthrows, even when successful, fail and kill and harm and make the world more lawless and destructive. The humanitarian warriors who support war on Syria because they care about Syrians should take note that the strongest such case was made in 2013. The President of the United States told us to watch YouTubes of little children dying and join him in supporting a war. And most of the United States said, hell no. It was only in 2014 when videos of white people getting their throats cut widely impaired the ability to think straight that large numbers in the US supported more war, and so blindly that it didn't even matter which side of the war they were backing. Wars are backed out of love and hate, the very same wars. but love alone has never mustered enough support to start a war, only enough to disrupt webinars. The case against Syrian war making is allowed in corporate media, but almost forbidden in progressive circles. How can there be anything wrong with, much less the whole enterprise be wrong, when it's fighting against foreign invaders who hide their evil intentions with lies and gin up fabrications to gain support? But even if it's forbidden to say and impossible to know the wisdom of pointing out the superior success rate of nonviolence, even if one cannot suggest that Syria could abide by an appeal to the rule of law despite international institutions conspiring against it, it ought to be acceptable to acknowledge that Syrian weapons kill and injure and traumatize, and to acknowledge that people, as in every other spot on the planet, have legitimate grievances against their government, even if other governments are trying to manipulate them to overthrow it. And to the extent that they are aware of that, one might say, despite the fact that other governments are trying to do that. I imagine us someday living in a world where one can say, I'm against war and not be asked which war, and say, I'm against that war and not be asked which side. And with that, I would like to introduce to you your host, who will introduce our speakers, and I'll be back with you for the question and answer section. Youri Smouter is the host of a program called 1+1, a topical history and current affairs program on his YouTube channel, Yuri Muckraker. He'll tell you how to find it. Maybe he'll put it in the chat for you. Youri is based in South Belgium. He's a media critic, an NGO critic, an anti-imperialist thinker, an indigenous rights solidarity advocate, and a socially liberal and left-wing thinker. Terrific resume there. Youri Smouter, take it away.
Well, thank you, David, for your introduction and all you've said. And I'd like to first begin by saying thank you very much to Rachel Small and Great Azaro and the entire World Beyond War Canada team, as well as the entire body of World Beyond War. It takes a lot of courage for you all to agree to co-host this event, organize it, and give a platform to the speakers here to speak out against the Western Gulf War on Syria. And I can't commend you all enough. You have my deepest admiration, and I'm very grateful and honored to be doing this with you. Well, hello, everyone. My name is Youri Smouter. As David said, I'm the host of 1+1. You can go to my channel at Yuri Muckraker at YouTube. I'll make sure to post the links in the chat. And yeah, tonight's event, which again, I'm honored to be co-hosting with World Beyond War, is about the dire need to end the Western Gulf War on Syria. And the panel of three gentlemen we have are some of the finest truth tellers and mythbusters when it comes to this topic. So I won't take up any more time, as I really want our audience to listen to all three speakers who will explain what's happening in Syria, how it all unfolded, and why the anti-war and anti-imperialist movement and the broader peace movement must be opposed to the ongoing Western Gulf War on Syria. Each speaker, who I'll introduce individually, will give a 15-minute presentation. After our last speaker speaks, David and I will do we'll do a Q&A. So leave your questions in the chat box. And if you came here by video, you can also raise your hand and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So without further ado, so our speakers are, Rick Sterling, Alfred Dzius, and Johnny Achi. And without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker. Rick Sterling is an independent, is a Canadian-American independent journalist, media critic, NGO critic, and peace activist. His brilliant writings on all things Syria and other important topics relating to imperialism and the new Cold War on Russia and China can be read at Mintpress News, Consortium News, American Herald Tribune, and Counterpunch. And he's also been a frequent guest on my program. And Rick, over to you. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much, Yuri, and welcome everybody. I've got a few slides that I'll share now. I hope you can see that. So I'm going to talk about Syria. I've been to Syria 5 times, starting in 2014, and most recently I was there in May on a delegation led by Johnny Achi, in fact. And so that's, of course, been a huge factor in understanding Syria and understanding the trauma that country's going through, understanding the extent of the media propaganda against Syria. And now, for some reason, it's not advancing. We tested this in advance.
Make sure to click on the PowerPoint window, Rick, not on the Zoom window.
Well, actually, I'm just clicking on the keyboard, which I clicked on before as we tested it. But
try to find little arrows within the PowerPoint.
Let's see. Maybe I'll try this and see if this works better. Slideshow.
Yeah, I can see the PowerPoint now, Rick's.
Right. You should have been able to see it before, weren't you? Couldn't you?
We were,
Yes.
but now it's minimized, so we can see the other one. So if you click on the next PowerPoint slide, I hope the audience can see it.
Here, I think. Okay, there we go. I don't understand what was going on there, but it doesn't matter now. To start with, let's take a look at some of the major features of what's going on in Syria today. Here's a map that comes from southfront.org, which does a great job of producing maps and military reports on a daily basis. So this one was from September 7th, today. The significant things here, of course, this is Syria, Iraq to the east, Lebanon to the west, Turkey to the north, and Jordan to the south. The significant things here are the US bases that I want to point out. There's very little discussion in the media of US bases. This one, where I'm dragging my cursor, is Al Tanf. And this one is located where it is because it's right sitting on the crossroads of the border, and this is the main Baghdad to Damascus highway, which the US wants to block and has effectively blocked. There was one time a couple of years ago where the Syrians sent a contingent to within 50 miles of that. They were attacked from the air and they were killed. The other significant portion here is the portion in orange, which is eastern Syria, and where there are about a dozen US bases. They're located strategically at the main oil producing areas and at the main transportation areas. Down in this area here where I'm circling on the east side of the Euphrates River, the Omar oil field is one of the richest in Syria. What's happening to that oil? It's being stolen. Let's take the oil is what Donald Trump said, and that's what they're doing. All of that oil is kept away from the Syrian government, and it's being shipped out either to the Kurdish region in Iraq or to Turkey. And there's other areas as well. This area is the major wheat growing area in Syria, and that is also being kept away from the Syrian government. So it's a major attack. It's major. It's really theft, blatant theft. The other thing that's significant about the map here is this little portion up here. I hope you can see my cursor. It's in the north at the Turkish border is what we call Idlib. Idlib is a governorate or province of Syria, And this is where the so-called rebels have congealed. And when they left Douma, when they left Aleppo, when they left different areas, they were taken by bus to Idlib. And this region has been controlled by terrorists since 2014. And this is, ironically enough, this is the area that gets all of the support from the West. In the next slide, I'll talk about the sanctions, but the International Rescue Committee, the big UN agencies, the World Food Program, some of them deliver some aid to the Syrian government, but the vast majority of it goes to Idlib and goes to this area here, where there's the numbers that are given are highly exaggerated. They'll talk about 3 million. It's probably more like 1 million people maximum, whereas in the rest of Syria, there's 16 or 17 million who are under heavy sanctions and who get very little aid or support. And being under sanctions, I'll talk about more later. But we've got this strange situation of the US occupying a portion of another country, of either stealing directly or through their puppet allies, stealing the wheat and the oil, and at the same time as the portion of Syria which is occupied by they're officially designated terrorists by the United Nations. In fact, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham is their name, but they are the official Al-Qaeda branch in Syria. And the West is basically using these two tactics to prevent Syria from going ahead. The economic war on Syria, that's a major portion of where we're at today. It was imposed, there have been sanctions on Syria for decades, in fact, but they really escalated to the highest extent with the congressionally passed Caesar so-called Civilian Protection Act. There's not protecting civilians it's doing the exact opposite. Those went into full force in June of 2020, right in the midst of the pandemic. Under the Caesar sanctions, no trade with the Syrian central bank, no trade or aid with the Syrian government, no trade with the energy sector, and secondary sanctions, which mean that any other country that wants to trade or do business or provide economic reconstruction investment, they cannot do that because the U.S. will retaliate against them. So some of the UAE, United Arab Emirates, for example, has wanted to invest in Syria to a greater extent, and they're under threat of sanctions by the U.S. The impact of the sanctions, food, there are wheat shortages. The cost of living in the last 18 months has gone up fivefold. Electricity in many areas is just a few hours a day. In other areas, there's a few hours on, a few hours off. Lack of medicines. Syria was very self-sufficient in medicines for the most part, but now it doesn't have the raw materials. So the pharmaceutical factories that have not been damaged, many of them have been damaged in the war, but those that have not been damaged can't get raw materials. Some specialized medicines, such as for cancer, they used to import. They can't import that anymore. There's what is referred to as over complicity in the community that analyzes sanctions, and so that pharmaceuticals or banks that might do business with Syria, they're afraid of getting fined by the United States. The penalties are on the order of billions of dollars. They're not trivial. They're huge. And it's like one person in Syria when I was there in May said to me, "You just accept your fate and die." Media bias and Western foreign policy. This is an article by Patrick Coburn, and he's talking about the lack of the reliance on so-called activists and so-called citizen journalists for getting misinformation. But it's actually much more than that. There's been censorship to the point that, for example, Seymour Hersh is one of the most well-known investigative journalists. He couldn't get his work on his investigations on Syria published in the US, so he had to go to London Review of Books. When he did a follow-up there on Syria, he couldn't even get it published there. He had to go to a German publication. There's widespread censorship, and there's been one PR campaign after another. There's been a lot of exposés of the white helmets, the Caesar torture photos, so-called. The Richard Engels kidnapping is an interesting case about propaganda, because that happened in 2012. The NBC broadcaster Richard Engels was in Syria, and he was supposedly kidnapped by pro-Assad militia. And he was abused for a couple of days and then supposedly rescued by some of the so-called Free Syrian Army. Years later, it turned out the whole thing was a hoax, that it had all been staged, and Richard Engels had to admit it. He wasn't involved in it, he wasn't on the inside of it happening, but he must have been aware after a few days that something was fishy, and he must have learned after he came back, but he kept it covered up. Now, the significant thing about this is, did Syrians come up with this idea? No, I don't think so. I think it was some of the Western handlers, whether it was from the CIA, from the US, or from the UK, we don't know. But behind the scenes, there are some people orchestrating the media and very attuned to public relations. And the goal has been to demonize the Syrian government, Bashar al-Assad, and to glorify, romanticize the so-called rebels. It's what Robert Perry said, you try to put black hats on what you see as the bad guys, and you put white hats on the good guys. And in Robert Perry's work around Nicaragua, of course, the white hat, they tried to put white hats on the Contras and the black hats on the Sandinistas. They had a hard time doing that. They're much more sophisticated nowadays. Just a few days ago, I think it's 4 days ago, we had a nice breakthrough. The BBC Executive Complaints Unit admitted that one of their significant reports on Syria had serious flaws. So they just scratched the surface. It was the tip of the iceberg of bias in their reports. But given the fact that the BBC is so averse to acknowledging their errors and bias, this is a nice little breakthrough. In this case, there was another journalist who challenged them. And I'm recommending to Aaron Mate of the Gray Zone that he file a complaint with the same BBC organization, because he's done a much more detailed examination of that. Now, this case is pertaining to a very important international organization called the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW. And the importance of that organization is because they're the international body that is supposed to be neutral politically, and that is supposed to investigate accusations of chemical weapons use. In 2002, the original Director General wanted to investigate whether Iraq in fact had weapons of mass destruction. The US, of course, Donald Rumsfeld and company did not want to do that. They sent John Bolton, who basically threatened him, said they knew where his kids went to school, and they had him removed. Now, then of course, subsequently, we know the US did the invasion, and then lo and behold, years later, we learned that Iraq, in fact, did not have weapons of mass destruction. So the Director General, Jose Bustani, wanted to prevent that whole disaster that's been such a disaster for the US as well as Iraq. The same organization is important in Syria because the US, the UK, and France bombed Syria on the basis of the accusation that in the town of Douma on the outskirts of Damascus, they claimed that the Syrian government used chemical weapons, and the U.S. and UK and France immediately said, "Well, yes, we agree with those reports," and went ahead with bombing. Subsequently, it turned out that the OPCW investigated, and the lead scientific investigators determined that no, there was not evidence of this. And in fact, if anything, there was evidence of the gas cylinder having been placed in place rather than having gone through the roof being dropped by an airplane. So it's an important story. But this BBC admission is just as I was saying, it's just the tip of the iceberg that they're dealing with. But I hope there's much more claims and a much deeper coverage of it. Even this little bit, I've noticed that the New York Times and The Guardian, which did big reports about how they were sure that Assad and the Syrian government was responsible, they have ignored all of this, and they've ignored the BBC's admission of bias. Now, this is the same story as I was saying. It's from just a few days ago. Well, this report is actually from yesterday. Just to let you know, there's a new outlet. It's called The Cradle, from the Cradle of Civilization, thecradle.co, and it's a good new publication. Those of you who follow Middle East and West Asia affairs will want to check it out. As I was saying, this May, I went to Syria, and for the first time, I observed a Syrian presidential election. It was really interesting. I've always been impressed in Syria. The people are so friendly, the people are so warm, and it is amazingly safe. It's much safer in Damascus than many big cities in South America, for example. So I was interested to see, how the elections was organized. I've been an official election observer in Honduras and in Venezuela. So I've got some experience there. And so this was interesting to see. The primary thing that was really striking was the people's enthusiasm. It was just amazing to see the crowds, and on the right you can see the purple ink, proving that they had voted. And there's young people coming out, there's old people coming out, there's Sunni Muslim women in the clothing they wear, the hijab, and there is the wide range, the beauty of Syria. And these young women who are teachers, it was charming to talk with them. I just asked them, why are you here today? And they said, we're here to vote for Bashar al-Assad. The US is trying to subjugate us. And that pretty much sums it up. There's a lot of Syrians who believe that. The night of the election, there was a huge celebration, and it was tens of thousands of people. The party was going on until 3 a.m. These are things that we don't see in the media here. I venture to say that 90% of the people on this call are unaware that there's such enthusiasm in Syria that they were really celebrating the election. They did it in defiance because the US dismissed the election beforehand, of course. They dismissed the vote for their president. Under the Constitution, this will be Assad's last term. Anyway, this was really impressive to see. It was the kind of thing you almost have to see to believe, and I did
Rick,
see
we're
it.
just running out of time at this point.
Okay, all right, I'm just about there, because this is the last slide, and it's another person that I talked with, a Syrian Red Crescent, said we respect the American people, the Saudi people, even the Israeli people. We have problems with the governments. We wish to live peacefully. This is the view of the majority of Syrians. And with that, I'll turn it back to Youri.
Thank you, Rick. Sorry we had to do that, but I'm pretty sure during the Q&A you'll have much more to enlighten.
No, I was done. I was done. It was perfect timing. Sorry if I went over.
No problem, no problem. Well, thank you, Rick, for that fantastic presentation. And folks, do check out Rick's body of work at Mintpress News, and I'll make sure to post the links to that and other places before we wrap up. So our next speaker is Alfred Dzius. Alfred is an international law expert, diplomat, author, professor, historian, anti-imperialist thinker based in Switzerland. Many of you who are involved in Venezuela solidarity will know that he was a special UN rapporteur who went to investigate the political crisis in Venezuela, and he spoke out against the impact of Western sanctions, and later spoke out against the Western-backed opposition and the war for oil and mining there. Since then, he's been a friend to the peace movement. He's also a friend to the ongoing efforts to free Julian Assange, the founder of WikiLeaks. He's an advocate for an international native indigenous lives matter movement. He is a supporter of Catalan political prisoners and the rights of Catalonia to hold a referendum on independence. He's an outspoken critic of Western imperialism and domination and the new Cold War on Russia and China. Mr. Dzius has a new book out called Building a Just World Order, published by Clarity Press, and is in the process of doing a new book critical of NGOs and semi-NGOs' roles in propping up different forms of imperialism called the human rights industry. He's also a frequent guest on my show. Mr. Dzius, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Youri. And thank you, David and Rick. I fully endorse that which David and Rick has told us. It is evidence-based, and it is correct in international law and in human rights law. The problem is that Syria is the emblematic case of Orwellian manipulation of information. We are in the midst of a propaganda war, of a non-conventional war, of a psychological war, and the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, CNN, Fox, BBC, even the Deutsche Welle and other organs have succeeded in demonizing Bashar al-Assad. Now, I'm no friend of Bashar al-Assad, but he was legally elected the president of Syria by the Syrian people. And there is a rule of international law that prohibits interference in the internal affairs of other states. And there is a judgment of the International Court of Justice that very strongly condemns the United States for financing covertly and overtly the Contras in Nicaragua. That was the 1986 judgment of the ICJ in the military and paramilitary activities in Nicaragua case. Now, it's quite clear that the involvement of the United States, United Kingdom, NATO countries, Israel, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, in Syria constitutes a major violation of the United Nations Charter, in particular, Article 2, Paragraph 4. And certainly, if the United States, Great Britain, and France were not permanent members of the Security Council that would have been condemned by the Security Council for violating the UN Charter. So we have this blockage, and in order to make it plausible to the American people to spend billions, if not trillions of dollars in these wars, then it's the media that take over to make it appear that we're doing something for human rights. We're doing something for democracy in Syria. Of course, it's ridiculous. And of course, our methods are illegal. But with the complicity of the entire structure, other than, of course, the alternative media, you've mentioned Aaron Mate, the Gray Zone, sometimes Amy Goodman of Democracy Now! Does something positive in this field. In any event, the masses of people have been brainwashed into believing we, the Americans, are the good guys and Bashar al-Assad is the bad guy. The fact that Bashar al-Assad is the legitimate, legally elected president of his country, the fact that he has been fighting terrorists, the fact that he has been fighting Al-Qaeda, et cetera, that simply gets swept under the rug. You don't get that in the news. By the way, my publisher, Clarity Press, just issued a book by A.B. Abrams, a book, by the way, that has excellent blurbs. The book's title is World War in Syria, and it just came out. You can get it through Amazon. And there's another book that I wanted to bring to your attention, and that is the book by Jack Baud. Jack Baud is a Swiss intelligence officer and an expert who has worked for 20 years for the United Nations. And he put out a book in French only, Gouverner par le fake news, and has a whole chapter on the manipulation of public opinion and fake news concerning the war in Syria. As far as international law is concerned, whether we like it or not, Russia is legally in Syria because Russia was invited by the president of Syria to assist in fighting the terrorists. And international law is what it is, and it falls the way it falls. So according to established international law, and if this were to be sent up to the International Court of Justice, there's no doubt that the International Court of Justice would find that the intervention by the US, UK, NATO countries, Syria, Israel and Turkey is illegal, whereas the assistance provided by Russia is assistance provided at the request of the sovereign, and the sovereign happens to be Bashar al-Assad. Now, beyond that, I wanted to mention what already has been brought to our attention by Rick Starling, the scandal of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. It is really a breakdown of the international rule of law. When you have an organization that is supposed to carry out objective investigations, and then it covers them up. When the result is not what they want, or that is what the United States and its allies want, then it has to be falsified. And if there are whistleblowers who come out and say so, then the whistleblowers are demonized. And even the first Director General of the OPCW, Jose Bustani, has demanded that there be an investigation into this cover-up, but there isn't any. And the expert Ian Henderson and others who came out and said, this is false. I mean, imagine, when the organization that is supposed to protect you, is supposed to aid in the prohibition of chemical weapons, is actually fabricating evidence in order to support illegal attacks. I mean, even if Bashar al-Assad at some point had used chemical weapons, which has never been proven. I mean, you need proof. If you're a lawyer, you need proof. And if there's no proof, it's in dubio pro reo. You need proof, and you have to listen to the other side. Audiatur et altera pars is one of the fundamental rules of law, but nobody wants to listen. You just want to condemn Bashar al-Assad ahead of time without any evidence. Now, all of that, as I said, is very well documented by this Swiss intelligence officer, Jacques Baud. But the mainstream, I have not seen any reviews of this book. I've not seen any discussion of that book, since what he's saying is not what the mainstream was. Now, another aspect, having worked in the United Nations for 40 years in various capacities, as consultant, as staff member, as rapporteur. I mean, I've seen the corruption of the system. That's why my new book is entitled The Human Rights Industry. I've seen rapporteurs who are sold out. I've seen rapporteurs who essentially do what they're told to do. And myself, as a rapporteur, I was under enormous pressure to, shall we say, falsify my findings. I was under enormous pressure, not only from NGOs and from lobbies, to write something entirely different than what I wrote in my report on Venezuela. Essentially, they wanted to dictate to me what I should write. And other rapporteurs let it happen. As a matter of fact, maybe 80% of the reports of the rapporteurs are not written by the rapporteurs, but are written by the Secretariat of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights depends on donations. The annual budget of the office is not that which the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly gives us. That is peanuts. What's important is what we get from donations, what we get from countries like Germany, like Sweden, like the Netherlands, etc., that do contribute millions of dollars to the budget. So follow the money. The donors set the agenda. That was not the case when Theo van Boven hired me 41 years ago, but that is the case today. Now, another aspect of corruption of the system. Take, for instance, the report on Syria of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. The report was published and then it was pulled out because of enormous pressure brought by the United States against this ESCWA organization. Happily, the report, although it no longer exists in the website of the United Nations, it does exist in the internet, and I will send to Yuri the actual report because I have it in PDF, and then whoever wants to have it can get it from you as a PDF document. But it's a report on the adverse impact of the Western sanctions on the health of the Syrian people. In other words, economic sanctions kill. And this report shows conclusively that because of over-compliance, nobody wants to deal with Syria, like nobody wants to do business with Cuba or with Venezuela, because if there is a risk that you might be whacked with a penalty of $200,000, $300,000 by the US Department of the Treasury, you say, the risk is too high. I'm a businessman. I don't want to go bankrupt. So I drop Syria, or I drop Venezuela, and I make my money elsewhere. So although theoretically humanitarian aid is exempt from the sanctions, because it is so vague, the language, a businessman says, I don't know what I'm getting myself into. So they decide, too risky, don't do it. So the medical doctors interviewed by the researchers who did this report back in 2016, and I repeat, is the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia. The doctor said, the medicine is not coming in. The replacement parts, say for scanners or for medical equipment, is not coming in because jumping all the obstacles that are on the way is so problematic that no one wants to do it. Now, who has been documenting these problems of sanctions? Already back in the year 2000, the United Nations Subcommission on the Promotion and Protection of Human Rights issued a 72-page report by Professor Mark Bossoit, who was the president of the Constitutional Court in Belgium, and whom I recently visited at his home in Antwerpen. He is a Flamand, he is a Flemish Belgian. In any event, he wrote, shall we say, the landmark study on the illegality of unilateral coercive measures. Then the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, back in January 2012, in report A/HRC/19/33, which I can send to everybody because I also have it in PDF, Navi very clearly condemned unilateral coercive measures and asked all countries to lift them or not to respect the extraterritorial application of United States legislation. Now, my friend, the late Dr. Idris Yasairi, he was the first rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, wrote a report on Syria and condemned the impact of these sanctions on the Syrian people. Subsequently, Alena Dohan, Professor Alena Dohan, who is the new rapporteur on unilateral coercive measures, has conducted several consultations and workshops, and actually she followed up on my report on Venezuela, and she actually went to Venezuela. And just to give you an idea of how compromised the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is, her report on Venezuela got lost. I'm not kidding you, got lost. And Alena has been reconstructing it, and it got lost not by Alena, it got lost by the office. So that although Alena Dohan is coming to Geneva to the 48th session of the Human Rights Council now, which starts next Monday, she doesn't have the report on Venezuela to present. The only thing we have in the public domain is the 12-page preliminary conclusions, which she issued in February this year, which fully confirm my own findings. But she has been subjected to massive mobbing and to death threats. I mean, I was subjected to pre-mission, during mission, and post-mission mobbing, but she has had even worse than I had. Another rapporteur who condemns unilateral coercive measures is the rapporteur on torture. That is Professor Niels Melzer. Now, Niels Melzer has just written a book entitled Der Fall Julian Assange, only in German thus far. It will be published in New York next year in English translation. As the case may be, Niels has complained to me about the mobbing he has been subjected to, and about the failure of the office to protect him, to defend him, and the failure of the office to provide the necessary support. Why does that happen? Well, easy to understand. The United States, the United Kingdom, and the European Union countries, they're all directly or indirectly involved in this criminal activity in Syria, as they have been involved in the criminal activity in Afghanistan. If the United Nations were to come out and clearly condemn it as totally illegal actions contrary to the UN Charter, etc., there are penal and civil consequences. As far as the civil consequences, the right to reparation, obviously the people of Afghanistan, the people of Syria, have a right in international law to be made whole again. Restitutio in integro. Since the activities of the United States and NATO in Syria are totally illegal, and the attacks, for instance, the attacks after the so-called Duma gassing, the attacks by the United States and France on Damascus were completely illegal, contrary to the United Nations Charter. Now, that triggers state responsibility. State responsibility means you have to pay basically trillions of dollars for reconstructing Afghanistan, trillions of dollars for reconstructing Iraq, trillions of dollars for reconstructing Libya, and trillions of dollars for reconstructing Syria.
Sorry, Alfred, we're nearly out of time.
Yeah, I accept it. Then I close it now, and I'll pick it up on questions and answers.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you for that presentation, Mr. Zayas. It's always a treat to learn and be enlightened by you, and thank you for all that you advocate. I look forward to getting your two books and several others of both you and David. And just before I introduce our last speaker, Mr. Zayas is working on a new book called The Human Rights Industry, where he's speaking out against NGOs and semi-NGOs. And he asks anyone who works in NGOs or used to work in NGOs and is involved in the peace movement to reach out to him, give all of your stories and so forth, because he's going to use that to, for this upcoming book. So, alrighty, our last truth teller and mythbuster tonight is Johnny Achi. Johnny is a Syrian American. He's an expat, a U.S. graduate of electrical engineer. He was a co-founding member of Arab Americans for Syria. I'll make sure to post the link to that in the chat box. and he has led many fact-finding missions to Syria over the past decade. And I was told that Johnny, that one of Johnny's most recent trips to Syria was during the last elections and monitoring that and the general situation. Johnny, an honor to have you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Yuri. Thank you, Alfred, Rick, for this amazing, report that you guys done. Let me just say briefly that I'm not a politician, I'm not a journalist, I'm not even an activist. I just like to say I'm a Syrian who has never been in politics. I don't have family in the army or in the Syrian government, but someone who always loved and been proud of being a Syrian. Grew up in Syria all my life until I came to the United States for schooling and stayed here. But however, I kept visiting Syria every year. My family lived there. I still have my mom there, my brothers. So I do visit Syria. I visited more during the last 10 years than I actually usually visit. Usually I visit either once a year or once every other year. In the last 10 years, I've been there 14 times. And these 14 times I needed to be there. I briefly will tell you, the first year of the Syrian crisis was impossible on any Syrian to take. We sometimes wonder how come the West or the left or the progressive are not taking the side of the Syrians. We Syrians couldn't take the side of Syrians. We were so confused and so battered. It was so embarrassing for any Syrian to say, I support my government, I support my army. I today, and I speak on behalf of probably 80% of all Syrians, by all Western reports, today and every day in this conflict, Syrian President Assad never lost less than 70% of support. In their own polling, they tell you he still enjoys 70% of his people. We'll get to a minute, if someone is killing his own people, why would 70% of his people want to still back him up? But I can tell you, we could not speak. I was maybe one of very few. I had to go to an Arab Americans for Syria for the lack of finding enough Syrians to stand with me. I went to an Arabs. I was able to recruit Lebanese. And today it's Arab Americans for Syria is mostly Lebanese and Palestinians, very few Syrians. So I speak on all these silent voices that could not speak, because every time I spoke, I was called a butcher, a liar, an Assad apologist. I was called conspiracy theorist, regime apologist. You call it, I've been called, and not to mention all the threats I got, all the, I lost my job. I stayed without a job for 4 years, between 11 to 14. So I took it upon myself to visit Syria more often because I needed to know the truth for myself. If you were to listen to the media, you have to be a super human not to be influenced by what you were seeing and hearing. In the beginning, and I think more than ever, the media played such a dirty work in Syria, like it's unprecedented. Not only they only told one side of the story, unfortunately, they even twisted that one side of the story. Even that one side of the story was told so wrong. There was nothing you can do. We could not defend it. And I couldn't have any friends. I went to progressive, a lot of groups that today are all with me. Even Aaron, when I met him in Syria, he said, Johnny, I was 5-6 years into this conflict, still talking against Syria and against the president. It took for a lot of us who are very well read and very well thinkers years to accept that what we were saying was maybe not true. My first trip to Syria was in 2011. I wanted to see all these rallies. Nobody in Syria knew anything. Everybody's saying, we'll watch it on the news like you do in America. I don't know what it is, non-existent. The whole 2011, I tried to go see one of these. We will get there either too late or there's only a bunch. No security forces ever around. Not a single time did I see one image of a security policeman shooting or battling or hitting. I see it in France all the time. I see it in Australia all the time. How could we not have yet seen? Show me, where is that crushing and killing? You could not have present one photo. On the contrary, the majority of the death in the first 90 days were by unarmed policemen. In the first 3 weeks alone, 21 policemen in Homs were shot. We have those videos that YouTube kept disappearing, kept taking away. I had 1,400 videos that were all taken down by YouTube. the algorithms of all these social media, we think we have social media, it's such an open space. No, we could not even through social media put the real images and put the real pictures because they were not appropriate. But their pictures, for the terrorists to put decapitation, it's okay because it advises, it pushes more people to go fight the jihad war in Syria. For all these extremists to flock into Syria, how did we get 84 nations to send? And that numbers, people say, how do you know it's 84 nations? Bashar al-Jafari, our US ambassador then to United Nations, presented 84 legal documents of either people killed or captured in Syria from 84 nations. All the Arab world sent, the majority were from the Arab world, from Saudi Arabia, from Libya, from Algeria, from Tunisia, from Kuwait, from everywhere, from Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, from Russia, from China, from as far as Australia. We have hundreds of United States fighters came to Syria to kill the infidel. Who is the infidel? That's what I don't understand. As Syrian citizens, every trip I go to Syria, I visit with Mufti Hassoun. He's the Grand Mufti. He's this voice of moderate Islam. He's the biggest name in Syria. And for someone to call Syrian government infidel, they don't understand that throughout history, Syria has been the shield of Islam. They have been the moderate of Islam. They have made peace between all the fighting. They always turn to Syria for moderation, to be the ones to have peace between maybe Iran and the Gulf state, have peace between other nations. We've never invaded the country. We've never been aggressive toward another country. So why should we suddenly turn against our own people? In 2010, I've been to Syria and we were going to migrate back to Syria. Actually, my brother and his American wife migrated in 2010. That's how great Syria was at the time. When the world was living a financial crisis, Syria was enjoying not just peacetime, it always enjoyed peacetime, but economic boom. Aleppo was considered the industrial capital of the whole Far East, Middle East, because the GDP was growing at 10–12% a year. 4,000 factories made by Syrians, for Syrians. All that was just too much to have, I guess. Suddenly, over 1 month, all that love for the president became hate out of nowhere. There gotta be something not right. So when I went and visited, I saw rallies. I saw hundreds of thousands of people rallying. I was one of them who joined. They say they're all organized. People were having the color of the Syrian flag on their faces, taking their children, going to rally in support of the reform, because President Assad took advantage of this so-called uprising or so-called Arab Spring and said, I'm gonna push for reform even fastest. Because yes, Bashar Assad is a Ba'athist, but he's a moderate one. And he had the old Ba'athists who did not want to have so much reforms. So he actually, within a month, abolished, martial law, put a new law for political, parties, multimedia, just opened up everything he's been wanting to do at a larger scale, did it all. And it was fine with majority of Syrians. The majority of Syrians who really opposed politically were okay with it. We were talking inside Syria. The ones that were represented by our enemies, these what we call expats, these are the opposition that the West and the US wanted us to talk to, not the actual opposition within the Syrian population, within the educated. They want us to talk to mercenaries. And obviously, there were 7 different groups. One belonged to Israel, one belonged to the US, one belonged to the UK, one belonged to France, one belonged to Turkey, one belonged to Qatar, and one belonged to Saudi Arabia. Their headquarters were there. And when we go to peace negotiation, actually, Syria, after a couple of man-made massacres, meaning they manufactured massacres to keep the Syrian government outside of the peace talks. They succeeded in keeping the government outside of the peace talks. So the peace talks was between all these other factions that already want to fight on the regime when the regime change. There was no doubt in anyone's mind that the regime was going to fall, just like, Saddam fell, just like Libya did, and it was turned for Syria. They were thinking about who's going to be ruling before they can actually, even Hamad bin Jassim said, we start looking at the reward before we let we call it sayda, meaning when you go hunting, you let the huntee disappear because you were too busy thinking what are you going to do with it afterward. I want to just bring up 2 very important turnaround point for me personally. In 2011, I was watching nonstop the CNN News and Al Jazeera, and there was one person, I don't know if anybody been following since then, his name, Dani Abdul Daim. Dani Abdul Daim was a British citizen of a Syrian descent. He was on CNN every single day, every day talking about pulling bodies of children from underneath. And every time he was live on CNN or Al Jazeera, there was a shooting in the background, nonstop shooting. It was so, I mean, devastating. We were like crying. We could not just bear the feel of it. Suddenly, and about 2 months later, a video was leaked out. As you understand, by the way, Dani at the time, he's not Syrian because his mom was Syrian, so he's not a Syrian citizen. What is an MI6 agent doing in the middle of Homs every day reporting for CNN and Al Jazeera? You wonder, what is he doing there? He didn't speak Arabic well. But that video, it was from a satellite. They have satellite phones. They're 300,000 because there's no internet, but they were able to broadcast phenomenally. This guy had a 300 grand of satellite phone. So what they do, they open the whole hour with CNN before they go live. But the whole hour is open. So whenever they're ready, CNN will go on that feed and make that feed broadcast. They leaked that hour, the whole hour that was open. And the whole part of it, the best part of it, that the actual interview was in there. So you cannot say we manufactured that because the actual interview for the CNN was in that middle of the hour. The whole 20 minutes prior of him going live, they were staging everything. They were saying, when I give you the sign, you start shooting. They were in a warehouse and sounded like this. To me was an amazing video, was translated, was sent to Anderson Cooper. Myself personally, I was able to go deliver it to New York's office, email him. I spent days and days and nights begging him to play or to listen to this video. And if he doesn't believe my translation, bring your own translators. Finally, 3 months later, Dani was silent and he appeared in New York, office with Anderson Cooper, and he made a mistake with his lifetime. He goes, no, we were about 21 kilometers away from Homs, which tells you he never picked up bodies of people. And Anderson Cooper never showed them again, and he stayed away from Syria for a long while because it was, he looked like an idiot for every night bringing someone telling imaginary stories about what was happening. This person getting, and he disappeared. I don't know where he's at. He disappeared completely. But to me, that was a victory. We stopped a little bit of that madness. The second most important thing for me, victory for me, 2014, and Rick, I was in Syria, and I hadn't yet personally met Rick. We just met by chance at that restaurant on the night of the night of the election. But in Lebanon, 3 days prior to the Syrian election in Damascus, there was the election outside of Syria, right? In the US, they closed our embassy a week before because they knew we were coming in the thousands. I had a Facebook page going to elect President Assad, and we had thousands saying we're coming. What an embarrassing scene would have been in Washington, D.C. to see thousands of Syrians carrying Syrian Bashar Assad and walking into D.C. They closed our embassy. So we managed to, about 30 of us, to go to Syria that day. Lebanon, who did not have an embassy closed. Dubai closed their embassy because there was also thousands who were going there. The scene in Lebanon that day, to me, told me, Johnny, you were right all along. Because supposedly who went to Lebanon were refugees who were running away from the aggressiveness and the butcherness of Assad and butcherness of the Syrian army. In Sky News report, they said over 800,000 people went through the streets of Beirut, clogged the city for 2 days. These people didn't have to show up because they say in Syria, it's the army forces you to go vote. These 800,000 to me was enough for the whole world to know you got it wrong. If these people were running from Mr. Assad, they would not have broken the gate to the embassy to finally wanted to make sure their vote counts. 800,000 in one country, in Beirut, where there's supposed to be about 1 million refugees. Those are two highlight points. Obama in 2013, when he wanted to send his troops to do what? To fight ISIS. I can tell you that was our worst year because ISIS grew in 1 year from 30% to almost 70%. Every bomb that the Obama military bombed was either Syrian fighters or Syrian civilians. Never seen those convoys of hundreds of Toyota 4x4, big, you know, in the desert. They could not see them. Russia came in on the invite, as Mr. Alfred said, on the invite of the Syrian, because we're losing control. In 1 month, they pretty much eliminated half of ISIS infrastructure. So if you really wanted to fight jihadists, stop supporting jihadists, stop fighting them in Afghanistan and support them in Syria, stop fighting them in Yemen and support them in different places. In 2013, I went to Syria prior to the Gaza attack. It's very important to mention about the Gaza attack because it's the funniest thing. In 2012, I did a speech with the Honorable Cynthia McKinney. We did a small kind of panel in LA, and I mentioned that they have not used one false flag that they did not use in Syria. Started with building the camps in Turkey prior to the uprising. They built the camps for human corridors. They're prepared for human corridors where there hasn't yet been an uprising. Then they put a date on the uprising. It didn't happen on the first date, February 15. They postponed the date for a revolution. How do you postpone a date for a revolution? It's not a football game that you have to have a kickoff time, right? It's spontaneous, supposed to be. Finally, I said they tried massacre. They made massacres of children in homes, and they called the Syrian army killers of children. Those massacres every eve of a United Nations or Geneva meeting would happen on the eve. How stupid does the Syrian government have to be that every time they have the next morning something to prove their point, to go and present their case, an awful, horrible massacre. Every massacre will get punished. One time we were taken away from the peace talk. The Hula massacre took all the ambassadors out of Syria. They closed all their embassies. We did not have a right to defend ourselves. And it's only the same guy who would come and discover this massacre. His name, Hadi Abdullah. It's discovered always by Al Jazeera TV. As soon as supposedly Syrian army commit this crime, kill these kids, open the door for Hadi Abdullah to come in and take pictures. Of Hadi Abdullah was in Karam Zaytun and Trimse in Hula. They're not close knit by, but how is he always the first one to discover this massacre? A lot of ugliness, a lot of hate, but that's not the Syrian army. We knew our Syrian army. Our families is from the Syrian army. 70% of Syrian population are Sunni Muslim. They are in the Syrian army. So what are you trying to tell me? What is all that hate, sectarian divide about Sunnis killing Shiite? In April 4th, I'll never forget, one month into this, 3 weeks into the uprising, a bus was going to Latakia, was attacked in Banyas, was ambushed. 11 soldiers were going to spend the weekend with their family, were ambushed and killed. Al Jazeera, of course, they got a hold on the bus, they got the 11 IDs. Al Jazeera, and that was the very first time in my life I felt I'm not Syrian. Where in Syria do we talk about who's Shiite, who's Alawite, who's Sunni, who's Christian? They put the 5 Sunni soldiers and the 5 non-Sunni, 2 Christians, 1 Alawite, 1, I don't know, non-Sunni. And they said on Jazeera, these are the 5 that were trying to defect from the army, running, taking the bus to a different place, and the other 5 prevented them from defection. So a firefight, and they all killed themselves. 2 months later, a video surfaced with them having no chance. They were ambushed like birds. They were killed all without even having a breathe. I met a father in 2013 by chance of one of these soldiers. He told me they killed my son twice. Once when they ambushed him in the bus, and once on Al Jazeera when they called him a defector. Okay, this is how we were treated. That either defection. So all the Syrian soldiers were dying. They were dying not on the hand of terrorism. No, they were fighting each other for trying to defect. They changed the narratives. They've changed everything about the truth. They never showed our rallies. They amplified their stories and glory, and they made the Syrian army as the children killers. And Bashar Assad, which I will talk about him in 2 minutes. But back to the 2012 with Cynthia McKinney, I said, there is nothing left. Next thing they're gonna tell you, chemical attacks. And they started laughing. 2 months later, Obama came out of nowhere. He said, chemical attacks is a red line. If you cross it, what chemical, where did that come from? Ambassador Jafari in the United Nations showed real evidence that sarin gas, when entered into the country and was given to terrorists, we showed evidence of the driver who was arrested after he delivered the sarin gas. The first attack, however, happened against the Syrian army. They didn't do it on themselves, they did it on us. In Khan al-Assal in March 2013. I went to Syria to meet the UN team that we requested they come visit to do what? To do research in Khan al-Assal to see what's the source of this gas attack. Is it a chemical weapon like they're saying? Nobody want to talk about Khan al-Assal. Why? Because the victims were Syrian soldiers, was not the terrorists or on the side of terrorism. It took United Nations 5 months. Finally, on August 20th, Cara del Ponte and her team arrived to Damascus. I was there. Now listen to this. The very next morning, 4:30 a.m., the Ghouta, Eastern Ghouta gas attack happened against the people of Ghouta. Now, how stupid again does the Syrian army have to be for finally receiving the United Nations team to go investigate Khan al-Assal? If these narratives were ever brought into Western media, they would have made sense. Because you gotta say, who's the beneficiary of these chemical attacks? Who's the beneficiary of killing kids? Who's really benefiting? You're gonna find out that it was not the Syrian army, it was always the opposition. These opposition are heartless. They'll cut their own child hand if they need to. They have the stories and the horror that I've seen, I don't have time to discuss, but I met with some of these fighters in 2014 who actually run away from certain areas that become the extremists took over, but they're still against the Syrian government. They had to carry weapons because once they get infiltrated, if you don't carry a weapon, you're gonna die anyway. So they forced Syrians to carry weapons, but the majority of the fighters were non-Syrian. They couldn't find enough Syrians to fight Syrians, so they brought us jihadists from all over the world. 2013, I took, God rest his soul, Mr. Ramsey Clark, to stop the war on Syria because it was imminent. I was there in August and I saw it after the attack in Ghouta, it was imminent. They're gonna bomb Syria. We couldn't fight against. Some people say 13,000, some people say 300 people died. No evidence of any kind of any sort. A chemical weapons, my friend, Ghouta is only 3 miles away from Damascus. A chemical weapons will take the family of Bashar al-Assad if it's a true chemical weapon that the Syrian army at the time had its arsenal since the 60s that didn't have any use of. I took Mr. Clark with me, and Mr. Clark, and yes, we met with President Assad. And yes, on my Facebook picture today, you see me with President Assad. I'm a proud supporter of President Assad. I have no shame. I have nothing to lose because this man saved Syria. If you talk to the people that Rick and I talked to this year, in this election, the joy, the happiness, they finally got rid of the Ghouta. Ghouta was freed in 2018 without bloodshed. When I met with Assad, Mr. Assad, I said, please help the people of Damascus, get rid of these terrorists in Ghouta. He said, we can't, there's too many civilians. I said, but people in Damascus, 5 million have suffered for 5-6 years. My home got a mortar bomb. I was leaving my house just before I opened the door, the mortar bomb hit. On average of 12 to 15 mortar bombs a day, random. Did the Western news ever talked about it? Would any US city allow a neighboring city to launch on the capital non-stop mortar bombs? But President Assad refused. We lost 16,000. He said, okay, 16,000 mortar bombs. Yes, we lost a few thousands and many, many injury. And most of them were kids. God knows, I don't know how these mortar bombs always hit school buses. I don't know. But he said no, because there's hundreds of thousands, millions of people living in Ghouta. When he finally, in 2018, and same thing in Eastern Aleppo, he negotiated them out. He didn't have to fight and impacted busy neighborhoods. He sent them to Idlib on air-conditioned buses to find them another day away. He actually evacuated all these terrorists with no bloodshed. So he was right all along to be patient. Ramsey Clark told me on the Mount of Qasyun, we were standing camping up there because Mount Qasyun was the first target to be hit. And there was a group called Over Our Dead Bodies. Hundreds of youngsters made a group over our dead bodies and went and camped on the top of Mount Qasyun. We joined them one night. Me and Cynthia McKinney and Ramsey Clark and Sarah Flanders and a few others were sitting there. Ramsey Clark put his hand on my knee and told me, and he saw the jubilance, people dancing. They're defying the US to strike him over our dead bodies because we know we didn't do wrong. Ramsey Clark told me, Johnny, not only are you not going to be defeated, you are going to bring the arrogance of the US down in the ground, and building nations and regime change are forever gonna stop. And that's what Syria was able to do. And I wanna thank you for allowing me to speak to you all. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you. Can everyone hear me?
I hear you, Yuri.
Okay, perfect. Wow. Well, thank you, Johnny, for your wonderful presentation, and thank you so much for being a voice for Syrians as well as Middle Eastern communities more broadly who refuse to be weaponized by the powers to be for a gruesome, insincere agenda which requires divide and conquer. So thank you so much for being here, and I hope we remain in touch. So, and I hope we remain in touch. Would love to interview you for my program in the future. Okay.
Sure.
We'll do our question and answer session. So David and I will read out questions. Well, David's going to read out questions from the audience. I'm going to look in the audience if anyone has their hands raised. David will read out the first question, and then he'll bring it to me, and we'll rotate it and for however much time we have. So David, what's our first questions?
Well, I may have to run in 4 minutes. I will try to stay later than that, but I'll try to very unfairly pick some small fraction of these questions. Let's start with this one. This was asked when Rick was speaking. What you've been saying about the economy is very similar to Lebanon, I think is what was typed there. What is the role of Israel in these places?
Israel is huge in there in a number of ways. Of course, Israel has been bombing Syria, regularly, sometimes every week, every week or two, for years on end. And Israel has been supporting the terrorists in southern Syria. Regarding Lebanon, I think that's a good point, because the sanctions on Syria have a huge impact on Lebanon. Syria was Lebanon's major trading partner for both imports and exports. So that's played a very important. The Caesar sanctions on Syria has hugely impacted and hurt Lebanon as well.
Should I take another question, Yuri, or you got one?
So far, no one seems to be raising their hands, but I know that during oh, did I see hands? Oh, Mort's Brussel has a question. Mort's, please do unmute yourself.
I'm just wondering about what the position of Russia is and how much help has come from them, or if there has been help from them. I know about their base in Syria and all, but if someone can make some comments about that, I'd appreciate it.
Who wants to say that? I think anyone can answer that one.
Okay. Johnny, go ahead.
I was going to let you, Rick, to go ahead. Russia's position has always been the same. Russia feels they have roots in Syria, traditional historical roots in religion. Believe it or not, I spoke to a few generals in one of the years, and he goes, I said, what's the price that Russia will have to accept to sell out Syria? Because everybody tells me Russia's going to sell you out, Russia's going to sell you out. They're going to make a deal over this place. And when I spoke with the general, they said one thing: we're not here for victory. We're here to bring peace back to Syria. Yes, they have ambition. It's their only base outside of Russia, right? So it's definitely, they have reason to believe that. But Syria to them is the back door. If Syria falls, there will be, what's the word? Oh my God, it skipped me. It'll happen again in their mountains. What's Uzbekistan? What is the Caucasus? In the Caucasus region, they've dealt with terrorism. They've dealt with extremists back in not too long ago. They defeated that, and now all of a sudden, all the extremism. If the Syrian government failed, it was going to become terrible for all the whole neighboring nations. Anyone who believed that Syria's moderate secular regime failing is a plus to anyone else is dreaming. It's only plus to one nation. Israel, because that is the ultimate goal, and that is Syria's ultimate price to pay, because it was their crime is supporting the Palestinian and Lebanese resistance. That's for sure.
Okay, we have three hands raised, so I'm going to go first to Emma S. I think I got that right. So Emma, what's your question? Please unmute yourself.
Hi. First off, I want to thank you guys for hosting this and everybody that's spoken. It's been amazing. How to simplify the question? I guess it's kind of about Turkish involvement, but I'm actually more curious. What is the situation for the Kurdish people in the present day, and how are they being protected with everything that's going on in that region?
Good question. Who wants to take a crack at it?
Another easy one. Go ahead, Rick, or if Alfred wants to join in.
Well, I'll take a crack at it. Of course, the largest community of Kurds is in Turkey, and the Progressive People's Democratic Party in Turkey, which is not just Kurdish, it's not exclusivist, and it's not secessionist, and unites all Turkish progressive forces, is really, I think, a good model. In Syria, the Kurds have, some of the Kurds in the so-called Syrian Democratic Forces have been manipulated by the U.S. They adopted that name, the Syrian Democratic Forces, to please their Special Operations Force commander. That's been documented. He was very glad when they came up, when he told them that they should rename themselves from the People's Protection Unit to something, to another name. So they have been, within the Kurdish community, there are some forces that realize that their future is part of Syria. And there's another part that's been being manipulated by the US and the secessionist tendency, and that those elements have also been part of the theft of oil and wheat.
David, I think it's your turn to read out a question.
How about this one? Jeremy Scahill years ago wouldn't speak at a Stop the War Coalition event alongside a woman named Mother Agnes Miriam because she was calling a chemical weapons attack a fake. What perspective years later does one have on those stands that were being taken?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's been funny. I noticed that when Alfred made a little compliment to Democracy Now!, the chat session blew up with people denouncing Democracy Now!'s coverage of Syria. So yeah, who wants to take a shot at that one?
Well, I can address it because I was a part of the group that organized the tour of North America by Mother Agnes Miriam, and her English is her third language. So some of her statements were taken out of context or were misinterpreted. She never said that the killings never happened. What she said was that a lot of the videos were fake and that had been prepared in advance, and I think subsequently that's been shown to be true. She also said that if you've got a problem, if Syria has a problem, you don't kill the patient to cure the disease. In which case, she was referring to some of the reforms that were wanted and needed in Syria. And so Jeremy Scahill was, it was a very poor, I think the aggressive pressure from people at that time was probably a part of it. It was certainly a part of it. They disrupted her presentation in numerous cities. They threatened they threatened various venues. They mounted various campaigns to prevent her from speaking. So, it was a good example of people who are preaching one thing and practicing another. Mother Agnes Miriam is a tremendous woman of courage. I know her personally. In fact, I visited her just a few months ago on returning from Syria. And she's a Palestinian woman, actually, who grew up in Lebanon and had worked in Syria for 20 years. So for some people in the United States who to condemn her, I think was very inappropriate. And it was really a shame on Jeremy Scahill. I hope he recognizes that now. Some people, there were other journalists, Max Blumenthal, who at the time was very much very hostile to the Syrian government, was believing a lot of the media stories, and subsequently reversed his position and has done tremendous work exposing the falsehoods.
Yeah, and I think Johnny also mentioned Al Jazeera. I think a lot of Western audiences got duped by Al Jazeera, which at the time does pretty good coverage and is pretty left leaning. But Al Jazeera, because it's owned by the Qatari state, really much jumped the shark on Syria. We have we had three hands raised. I'll try to get to all of them. Caroline Escar, would you like to ask your question? Oh, you have to unmute yourself first, though. Oh, Caroline, you're muted. Still muted. But you can.
I know, I'm here.
Okay.
I got it. Okay, it's a question because I tried to do it before and the computer wouldn't cooperate. I have been following this. Rick mentions Mother Agnes Miriam's tour. I was part of the group that put her on in Oakland, as you recall. Anyway, I am wondering whether the Grand Mufti of Damascus, I suppose, was one of the signatures of this incredible document called A Common Word Between Us and You, where like dozens and dozens of Muslim leaders wrote to a good handful of Christian leaders asking for conversation and more collaboration together between these two Abrahamic religions. It would be kind of interesting if they could include the Jews in this, but that would be a whole other ballgame. But did the Syrian Mufti, I could pull it up, but I can't remember if he is one of the signatures of this. My bottom line question is, who is threatened by the fact that Syria, as one of the original homes of Christianity, is a country where the religions live together in harmony and are not at each other's throats all the time, is the example of harmonious relationships a threat to anybody, and if so, who?
Gentlemen, any volunteers for that question? I think, Johnny, did you want to answer that one? Or
yeah, I think if I understand the question right, being, the cradle of religions, of all religions, really, Syria is. And the amazing thing about Syria, and not a lot of countries can say that, Syria existed before religions. So Syria was there. Syrians were there before Judaism and Christianity and Islam came about. So we were all Syrians and still Syrian, regardless of whether we're Jewish, Christian, we're the same. We're either Aramic, we could be Assyrian, we could have been, all these people who lived in this for 7,000 years. So you could not have a more mosaic, peaceful community than Syria. Rick will tell you, most Muslims, I grew up with a Muslim. I protect Islam because I don't think it's my Christian background is going to help me when the terrorists get me. It's my neighborhood, my Muslim neighborhood, who's going to protect my back. That's how Syria been and always will be. We've never had a civil war. This was not, by the way, a civil war. We'll go. That's a whole discussion by itself. But we never had it. We've been invaded, yes, by many, many, many empires over the years, but we've always remained Syrian. So Syrians are safe. Christianity is safe. Islam is safe. Judaism would have been safe if they did not attack the last Senegal and Jobar, when the terrorists got in there.
Mr. Zayas, did you want to say something?
Yes, Yuri, actually, I wanted to ask Johnny whether he would be available for a side event at the Human Rights Council.
Oh, don't worry, we'll definitely work on all of that.
Yes, because I mean, I have my network and I can inquire and I can offer Johnny and see when it can happen. It won't happen now for the 48th session of the council, but we can plan it for the 49th. And especially if there's a new report of the so-called independent experts on Syria, it would be important to have your point of view. And if I'm not mistaken, about 3 years ago, Mother Agnes was in one of these side events in Geneva, in which
UN.
I participated myself.
She
And
testified.
she was very well received. Her message was understood by the audience, and we had a full room. I think it was room 23, and there must have been 150 people in the room. The dismaying aspect of all of this, although in side events at the Human Rights Council, extremely good, solid information is disseminated to the audience, it does not seem to have any effect on the diplomats, on the ambassadors. I mean, you may have a lovely event, you think that you have succeeded in making your point, you're in the Palais des Nations, you are in room 20 in the Alliance of Nations room, and then there's no follow-up. As I said, even in my experience as a special rapporteur, having written 14 reports with very concrete, pragmatic, implementable recommendations, do you think that any of the recommendations have ever been implemented? No. And I've asked friends, other rapporteurs, like Ben Emerson, like Juan Pablo Bohoslavsky, like Idris Yazairi, any of your recommendations implemented? They don't know. Why? There's not even a follow-up procedure. We cannot even find out whether our recommendations are being taken seriously. That's why my fear, and that feeds into my book on the human rights industry, is that this is a Potemkin kind of human rights structure. There it is, it looks very nice. But what is actually the bottom line? Are we really helping victims? Or is it just an arena where gladiators just slash each other as a big spectacle, but the victims are completely forgotten? The idea is to demonize Bashar al-Assad, to demonize Nicolas Maduro, to demonize Daniel Ortega, etc. It is not about helping the people of Syria or helping the people of Venezuela. And the concept of human rights has been so demeaned by these people who just throw it around and they master the jargon. But
I'll have to interject. Unfortunately, David had to go, and I've got. Actually, Rachel, can we probably? Is it possible to probably do 3 quick round fire questions? Or
no, we're out of time. We have to wrap up in 1 minute.
Okay, then I'm gonna do this. Anyone, just email me very quickly, and I'll give the closing. Give me your email address, and I'll make sure that I can answer your questions, because I have Rick, Johnny, and Alfred, and I'll make sure that they get to your questions in the future.
Gentleman, Geoff Shaskin has been raising his hand throughout the whole time. Geoff Shaskin.
Unfortunately, Rachel says to me that we have to close, so I'm going to just Yeah. So unfortunately, we have to close. So guys, make sure to contact Rachel, contact me right now, and I'll make sure that we get that we get in touch with everyone. Oops, wait 1 second, and then I'm just gonna do some closing remarks.
It's always so hard with these events to wrap up. There's so many more great questions. We will send a follow-up email to all of you that has the link to the recording of this event, so you can pass it on to others who you think might want to watch it. And we'll give an opportunity in that email as well for our speakers to share some of the links and the reports they've mentioned here today. So you'll all get that in your inbox. And feel free to reply to that email with any additional questions, and we'll do our best to see if those can be answered. The best situation is like this, where the discussion is so engaging and we can't get to all of it. So thank you so much to everyone for that.
Yeah. And I also just want to say, I also just want to say, so thank you to Rick Sterling and everyone. Check out his incredible work at Mintpress News, which is led by Minar Adley, and you have Miko Peled, Whitney Webb, Elizabeth Voss, Alexander Rubinstein, Alan McLeod, and Dan Cohen there. We've posted Johnny's Facebook page of Arab Americans for Syria, but unfortunately the website's been removed. But check out SyriaSolidarityMovement.org, I believe. And if you want to check out Alfred Dzius's work, go to dzaisalfred.wordpress.com, and I'll make sure to also put the links. And then just before we also go, I just want to thank David Swanson again. Check out his work at davidswanson.org, his SoundCloud page, soundcloud.com/DavidC and Swanson, and also check out his YouTube page, After Downing Street Videos.